Hi, I'm Mitch Gallagher from Sweetwater. Thank you for joining us today. We have a very special guest we're going to be chatting with. This is Marcus Ryle. It's great to see you.
How are you, Mitch?
Always a pleasure to have you here at Sweetwater.
Always a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, well, I think you're uniquely positioned with your long history in the industry to talk with us about some of the things we want to go through today, and reaching all the way back to the early days of Oberheim, right?
Yeah, that was my start in 1980 when Tom Oberheim gave a teenager a shot at designing synthesizers, which was a real lucky opportunity for me.
And that sort of led into what we want to talk about today, which is sort of the genesis of the whole home studio recording revolution thing. And we were just chatting, and I hadn't thought of it, but you pointed out that really there were some components from Oberheim that were instrumental in leading that forward.
Yeah, so if you think about where things were at in 1980, right? Obviously, we had, great professional analog multi-track recording studios, if you could afford it. Mm-hmm. You had the ability to record some at home, but maybe with a Porta studio or something like that, or somewhat affordable 4-track reel-to-reels. Drum machines were analog, were glorified organ rhythm boxes.
Right.
There wasn't much really in the way of sequencing to speak of. Roger Lynn, I think, really was the first start of this revolution. And being a musician who saw a need, right, and a guitar player, being able to have real drums, actual samples of real drums, so I could get musical ideas as a songwriter, by myself. That was a real breakthrough. That was around 1979, 1980, right around when I started at Oberheim. I think there were a lot of musicians, and myself included, this notion of being able to just kind of noodle around by yourself before you necessarily, brought something to the band or recorded or whatever. And drums seemed like a great place to start. And at Oberheim, we saw that and wanted to jump into drums as well. And at the same time, I was designing the DSX, which was a polyphonic sequencer. This is still a bit before MIDI. There was no standard of how these things could talk to each other. So at Oberheim, we had the notion of, if we could have a multi-track polyphonic sequencer that hooks to your synthesizer, the OBXA at that time, and then the OB8, and have that directly connect to a drum machine, which was the DMX, and be able to have these synchronized, be able to quantize together, loop together, and so on. This seemed like this could be really useful as a composing tool and so on. So that was kind of the beginning, and it was a really exciting time because it was almost immediately we heard the impact, like on the radio, right? There were songs, Sting talked about a lot of the Synchronicity album, being written on an Oberheim system, and then a lot of pop songs. You'd hear the drum machine, you'd hear that stuff. Fun tidbit for me, I got to actually hear myself in all those recordings because I'm one of the 4 hand claps in the DMX. So there's, if you recognize that.
That's the vintage hand clap right there.
It was really great, but at the same time, if you think about it, 1981, a DMX, a DSX, and an OBXA cost like almost $10,000 in 1981 dollars.
Right.
So this was rarefied air. This wasn't even for me, honestly. Right? It's like I wouldn't, if I wasn't at Oberheim, I wouldn't have been able to afford this gear, that I was dreaming of and to be able to have.
Yeah.
But it showed the beginnings of what might be possible. Now, other companies were doing some sequencing and started doing more drum machines, and then thankfully Dave Smith, realized it sure be good if all these things could talk to each other.
Right.
And so I had met Dave back when the Prophet 5 was introduced. I'm fortunate enough, I was 20 at the time, but went with Dave to Japan in 1981 for the first talks of what became MIDI.
Wow.
And, so now things really had a chance to open up. Oberheim, sadly went out of business in 85, and another Oberheim engineer, Michel Doidic, and my wife, Susan Wolf, the 3 of us started a company called Fast Forward Designs to design products for other companies. And not too long into that, we met the folks at Alesis, Keith Barr and Russell Palmer. And Keith Barr, as a brilliant engineer, he wanted to do a sequencer and drum machine. And he knew that I'd done the DSX and knew that history. Those talks quickly turned into the HR-16 and MMT-8.
Yeah.
And you think about it, it's like, there's DMX and DSX.
Right.
But reborn 6 years later with the advantages of MIDI, a whole bunch of more features, better sound. These 2 boxes were $800 together. I think I might have been retail. You probably
I think that was retail,
was even sold even cheaper. So that was really the first time we realized what could happen when a large number, I mean, thousands of people started buying those. Sweetwater, I think, sold a few.
Yeah. I remember back in those days, I'd see the full page, the back cover of Keyboard Magazine, and some of those magazines with the Oberheim systems and the stuff, and dreaming about that.
Exactly.
And then when this came out, it's like, oh man, a whole new world has opened up to be able to. I can actually afford that drum machine, and start making music.
That was a key part of it, and to be able to make it that. I mean, quite frankly, these are both much more advanced and have many more capabilities than that original Oberheim did. So it wasn't just cheaper, it really enabled you to do so much more. And with MIDI, of course, you could hook up lots of synths if you wanted. Yeah. And so that was a wonderful evolution. And then again, being able to hear, next thing you know, you're hearing HR16s, HR16B, hearing these on the radio and hearing the influence they have. That was really gratifying.
That had to be exciting.
Yeah.
So what was still not there yet was the audio recording part of it. And you could buy a Tascam half-inch recorder if you. They were still expensive though. Or Fostex had a 1/4 inch.
I had the was it the R8? I think
that's right. Yeah.
1/4 inch, 8-track. And that was about all I could afford. And it was pretty decent, but everything you recorded at home sounded like a demo. Yeah. And everything recorded in the real expensive studios sounded like a record, right? So that was the dilemma. And if you recall at that time, so these machines, actually the DSX and DMX could do it as well. They would have a sync out. You could record a track on your multi-track if you want. So you could synchronize. It's kind of a way you got more tracks, right? All your drums and synthesizers could be playing in real time. And you still had 7 tracks left to do vocals and things like that. But those audio tracks just never sounded as good. Right. So I was fortunate being in LA that in the 80s I was doing a lot of session work. So I was also getting spoiled and being envious so that I'd go into all the best studios in LA, and around that time you'd see, a Sony Dash machine. You see a 3324 or 3348 or the 3M or Mitsubishi. These were incredible multi-track digital machines that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Right. And so, they, it was just amazing to see. Well, that just seemed like the next frontier, and definitely one of the biggest projects I was involved in. Quite a team of people, starting with Keith Barr, the founder of Alesis, to take on the daunting task of, is it possible? That's really where it starts. Is it even possible to make an affordable digital multitrack, and what might that be like? It's probably one of the few products I've worked on in my career where it was universal, that every single person working on it knew this is going to be giant if we can do it. We didn't really know if we could do it. That was the scary part.
Yeah, right.
But we just knew it's like this is a real game changer if we can pull it off. So we started that I think around 1988. Okay. So these came out in, I think it was early '87. We did in the Quadraverb, and so Alesis was doing really well, selling, Quadraverb and these machines were selling tons of. So that kind of enabled Alesis to be able to afford to delve into such an ambitious research project. Took some years, and then finally in '91, we launched the ADAT. It's certainly for me, that was made me feel like, I think, kind of actually have a real studio at home now.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I mean, it changed everything. I remember when they came out, of course, they were very scarce at first.
Yes.
And the store I worked at, we'd get one in and they'd be pre-sold and spoken for and things. So it was actually quite a while before I got one that I could actually get one for myself, because everyone that came in was sold. But it just changed everything, because it was $39.95, right?
That's
Originally was the retail price for it.
$4,000. Some stores were selling it for more back then because they could.
Yeah.
But that was $500 a track for a digital tape recorder was, again, in today's dollars, $4,000 sounds quite expensive. But then, I mean, they weren't just buying one, right? Because the other innovation we did here was this notion that it was scalable.
Right.
If you wanted 24 tracks, you could just buy 3 of them and they synchronize together like one machine. So it was, only $12,000, but that was a lot better than $150,000.
Right. Yep. And the media even was a lot less expensive, because a 2-inch tape, was not a cheap media to purchase,
That's
whereas
really
a
true.
SVHS tape, you could go to any video store and buy, I need to record a track, I can run down to Blockbuster and buy a tape.
Exactly. You go to Blockbuster and get your recording tape. It was about $10.
Yeah.
But remember, we're storing digital data. That's actually that $10 was buying you about 2 gigabytes of storage. In 1991, there was no such thing as a 2 gigabyte hard drive. Right? You know, we were still counting in megabytes back then. I mean, to put up 2 gigabytes, you're going to probably spend thousands of dollars. And hard disk recording, you know, was something that was still kind of a dream. I mean, you know, Pro Tools launched around the same time as ADAT. Our Sound Tools, which became Pro Tools. I mean, Evan and Peter at DigiDesign were really forward thinking about where this would go. But in those early days, the hard disks were so expensive. The ability even to back them up was non-existent. Some started backing up to ADATs, actually.
Yes, that's right.
But so this was a real efficient storage medium. It was just the right place, the right time. And we figured it had probably a good 10-year life before hard disks were going to get affordable enough to where, you know, that's where it was going to go. It was going to, we saw that it was destined to get to the computer, but the computers and the hard drives weren't ready yet.
I had 3 of them in a BRC, which was the remote control unit, and you had a 24-track studio. To be able to have that in your living room or your basement or your bedroom was just unprecedented. I think the other cog in the wheel at that time was probably the Mackie CR1604, which was the mixer that you'd buy one of these, you buy the 1604.
Mackie 8 bus, Mackie,
later the 8 bus,
Greg and I joke about that a lot. It was a great little symbiotic relationship during that time with meteoric rise. The BRC was a lot of fun too. We were very creative with product names. Do you remember what BRC stands for?
Big remote control, right?
Big remote control.
Because it came with the little remote control.
LRC was included. That was the little remote control.
Wow.
But the BRC lets you could do up to 128 tracks with the BRC, and you could bounce tracks. You know, I think it was the first remote control that was. It's really, we were trying to think like musicians more than sound engineers, because you could do MIDI clock. You could set bars and beats instead of just a time code.
Right.
So you could actually tell machine 2, you know, go to chorus 2 while machine 1's on chorus 1 and bounce vocals. Things we kind of, you know, sounds so prehistoric today.
Yeah.
This notion that I could fly vocals in easily from one chorus to another. You know, there was no copy and paste on like we're used to in DAWs today.
Yeah.
So that was a lot of fun. It became a real useful production tool.
I thought I was on Jeopardy there for a second. What is big?
What is BRC?
Had to dig deep to remember that one. That's cool.
You did well.
That's pretty funny. So that really took the recording aspect of it into the world. Around that time, of course, microphones became less expensive for things. But to me, really, the next really big jump for home recording was finding a way to be able to do your guitar tracks at home without having to crank up the Marshall stack and work at amplifier volume levels.
And that's certainly how we saw it. Essentially, it's like the ADAT kind of upped the game for just all the electronics fidelity, right? It's like suddenly I didn't have just tape hiss and distortion all the time. I could have real good audio quality. So that upped the game, like with Mackie. Mixers needed to be better and so on. But most people recording at home, they didn't have a good recording environment.
Right.
Right? And they may not have even had the education, the experience of like, how should I might have a great sounding guitar amp, how should I mic it up?
Right.
You know, and do I have a good sounding room? Do I have bad reflections? Do I have all kinds of, so recording guitar was pretty difficult. Recording keyboards became very easy.
Right.
And most things that you could record direct. And even vocals, you know, obviously you care about what's around you acoustically, but there's not as many variables as with recording guitar.
And there was no YouTube. You couldn't just call up a video on how to record. If I remember correctly, even the first really big recording schools were later in the 90s and heading more into the 2000s before we saw some of the, the more commercial, the larger recording schools and things. So there just weren't the resources to learn how to do that stuff.
Right. And it was a skill in and of itself. I mean, people would train to be a recording engineer, so you'd understand about mic placement. You'd understand about mic patterns, and you'd understand about comb filtering and other issues and reflections and things like that. A guitar player, ideally, they've been focusing most of their time on mastering their instrument, mastering the tone they hear, right? But how to capture it. So, so we worked our way from 80 all the way through to 91 or so with ADAT, and then we started line 6 in 96, and in 98 we introduced pod. And that, we first brought modeling to guitar amps themselves, thinking that's still the way guitarists are most used to creating their sound. But pod, the real goal was whether, at that time, whether you're recording to an ADAT or recording right to a computer, because that was now more common, could you have one box that replaces that whole signal flow? It's figured out the mic placement and the cabinet and everything, and you can choose what amp you want and what effects you want. And that was a pretty exciting project as well. That exceeded our expectations. I think we kind of hit a nerve there of something that was a real need.
Right.
And finally brought modeling to a level of sound quality that people were inspired by. So that was...
Yeah, it's hard to remember, and certainly if you didn't experience it, it's hard to imagine what it was like to... I did one of the very first reviews on the pod for EQ magazine, and I remember getting the box and opening that up and plugging in for the first time and hearing a produced guitar tone come out, and that's just, you can't imagine what a revelation that was at the time, kind of like this, to not have to worry about hiss, not have to worry about any of those kind of things. Each of these things was just brand new.
Yeah.
There was no context really to judge it against it, so it was really an interesting and exciting time to be delving into this stuff.
It really was. That was also another interesting inflection point because the computer recording was starting to take off. The same year we introduced pod, we introduced AmpFarm, which was a TDM plugin for Pro Tools, where we brought our amp modeling purely into the software world.
Right.
So there was kind of that was, I believe one of the earliest of where amp modeling lived in the computer. And so that now you could record in the hardware world with pod, or you could start the process of being completely in the box if you wanted.
Right, and of course that whole category has just exploded with the guitar, and of course line 6, of course, is still so prominent and all that.
Well, that's been so exciting to watch. Obviously, since I retired from line 6 and Yamaha in 2019, but it's just exciting to watch how the team has really continued to carry things forward. And the Helix now, it's so fun to see that what's possible when you have so many more times the processing power of that original pod. That original pod, it's kind of like going back and looking at the original Mac, right, or something. It's like, how quaint, 128K of RAM.
Right.
The pods, it still sounds great. I still have a Pod 1. It's a vintage digital, you could say.
Yeah, right.
But now, the Helix is just so much more processing power, and that's enabled the modeling to advance to an unbelievable level of detail. So that's
right.
It's fun to see how that world's been able to take advantage of just advances of technology.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's interesting that you mentioned you retired from line 6 in 2019, but you've kind of gone back full circle.
Yeah.
Because now you're at Oberheim and working with them.
Yeah, it's really gratifying. I mean, I thought it might be time to slow down a little. I haven't figured that part out yet, and just started, doing some advisement for some industry friends and companies and things like that. Tom Oberheim, he gave me my first job. He's still a great guy who still loves synthesizers. The possibility that came up to be able to kind of revisit anew those classic synths, to work with Tom, to work with Dave Smith and the sequential team, right, and to really do it right was unbelievably gratifying. And so synthesizers are my first love. It's just a lot of fun to be working on synthesizers again and seeing where we could take it into the future.
Well, that is a good transition there, because I have to ask you, having been at the forefront of so many of these things that really resulted in the home recording world we're in now, what do you see in the future? Where do you think things will go?
Yeah, it's a good question. I can't say I know, to be quite honest, but it doesn't worry me, because what's interesting is that at every phase that we talked about, starting from 1980, whatever tools we had at that time, at every generation, you think, this is amazing, what we can do today with all these tools, right? If you're just present in the now, you can't necessarily imagine. I mean, in 1980, we couldn't imagine what it is we're doing today.
Right.
And it's easy to almost imagine for today's snapshot to think maybe we're kind of done, right? Is it over? I guarantee you, if we if I'm still around, if we're having this conversation again in another 20 years, we'll be looking back fondly at the quaint tools we have today, because the capabilities of technology and how it will just inspire new ways of making music. It's limitless, you know.
Yeah.
So specifically with Oberheim, I think taking analog synthesis, digitally controlled analog, into the future and taking it places that we all wish we could have at Oberheim. Had Oberheim not gone out of business in '85,
Right.
It's you have a second chance like that is really exciting. So we'll come up with some new goodies. I think you guys will enjoy.
I can't wait. Can't wait. So cool. Marcus, thanks so much for taking a walk down, I guess we'll say, memory lane with this stuff, but also it just gives you context on where we're at. And I mean, what a golden age we're at. I mean, it's amazing the things we can do. But as you said, it'll be fun to look back in 20 years and say, boy, were they
quaint.
That's a
yes,
good
these
word.
are quaint times.
Great to see you.
Great to see you.
Hope to
It's
be
my
back here at
pleasure.
Sweetwater again soon.
Absolutely.
Always great to see you. And thank you for joining us here, coming to you from Sweetwater with Marcus Ryle. I'm Mitch Gallagher.